Good afternoon, my friends. Today it's a nice cold November day, nice and sunny as well, although it's been kind of off and on with the rain lately. Yesterday there was kind of a windstorm going on, which was a little bit disconcerting. There was a lot of, I was just walking around outside the other day, and there was just a lot of trees and debris just sort of scattered all over the place, a lot of broken trees, just, covering up walkways and sidewalks, so it wasn't that good. A lot of people lost some power yesterday too. Luckily I wasn't one of them, but I was definitely hearing a lot about it. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about a topic at hand that's obviously quite controversial in its nature, and that's the topic of violence. Violence in and of itself is something a lot of people like to avoid. Like a lot of people like to claim its evilness and how evil it is to exist in the first place. And I'm here to talk a little bit about understanding the importance of violence and how it could be used in a different context. When we're presented with violence, we are obviously inclined to self-defense. And when we do not understand violence, when we do not understand where violence comes from, how violence works, we become completely absorbed with emotional outbursts, right? Which is the violence that is uncontrolled, the violence that is unpredictable, is when it becomes consumed by the emotional output of violence, which is when it becomes toxic, because it becomes a distortion of what violence actually is. When violence becomes incredibly controlled, understandable, it is actually a lot more effective in terms of whatever you're trying to accomplish. Whether that's good or bad is irrelevant. That sort of stands the test of time. It's in my opinion that anything that's violent, that's aroused by emotional aspects, ideological aspects, anything of that nature, anything that's emotional, anything that's very I believe we need to do this for the right reasons. That's when violence becomes out of hand, when there's an ideological aspect to it, or if there's an emotional, this guy is making me mad, this guy's not fair, blah, blah, blah. My wife didn't cook my meat the way I like it, fuck her. That's the kind of violence that's fueled by emotion. Then there is the other aspect of violence, which is there where you're not guided by these distorted mindsets. You're guided by a sense of vision, I would say. There's the violence that is guided by, I need to get something done, and there is no way around it, and you sort of deal with it. And this is mostly known in self-defense. If we're going to talk about a very specific example of something where violence is necessary, and that's always in self-defense. I've been practicing a form of martial arts, a form of kung fu, in order to understand this, but I've also been interested in martial arts for quite some time. And there's one thing you notice when getting into the world of martial arts and of understanding people who are into martial arts, is that they sort of fall into two different camps of people. And quite honestly, the majority of people who are into martial arts it also depends what style you're learning too. I should emphasize that, but just for sake of argument, for sake of not really having to go into too much, details of styles and where people are into, what age these people are also is a huge factor. You'll find that most martial artists tend to be very calm, very collected, very pacifist people in general. They're not going out looking for fights. They know how to fight, but they only know how to fight in certain contexts. They know how to fight in a specific context, and that's because of their deeper understanding of violence. Their understanding of violence in a very pragmatic way. And I think it's important to understand violence, and I think what's happening in the world is that we're running away from violence we're running away, we're anti-violence in a way, and that's creating this violence at the same time. You look at things like Antifa, who are against violence, and they are against violence by being violent in themselves. The only difference is that they're highly emotional, highly driven by ideology, and they want to kill people. Whether or not they do or not is irrelevant. If someone died that they didn't like let's say like Donald Trump, or if we're in Canada, everyone hates the People's Party of Canada for whatever reason, because they don't like political correctness or whatever. So if Maxime Bernier died, they would rejoice, they would celebrate. And you see this a lot with these kind of extremist movements. When a person of their opposition, of their ideology dies, they're celebrating, they're rejoicing in this fact, which is a very imbalanced, violent way to think about things. They're not violent in a physical sense, but they're violent in a mental state. And it's primarily driven by their emotional outbursts, by their ideological outbursts. And they claim to be people who are against violence, that they're peacemongers, whatever. And they don't understand what violence is. They don't understand the use of it, how to handle it, and when violence comes to you, how to deal with it, which I think is a very important part of learning about life. And I think it's why everyone should sort of learn martial arts in some degree. There is an aspect of learning self-defense in martial arts where you understand violence because you're in a real situation where someone is actually trying to hurt you, not literally, because obviously if you join a martial arts program, you shouldn't be, at least if you're a beginner and you're not planning to make a career out of becoming a martial artist, like MMA or boxing, you shouldn't really be getting hurt a lot. You shouldn't really be in a very violent context. It should be pretty safe. But just for the sake of this, you should understand how violence works, how people will attack you, and how to deal with that as well. And so that's one side of the martial arts, but there's also the other side where you have a lot of these toxic people that haven't had the opportunity to control their emotions, to understand their emotions, to express themselves properly. And they enter into martial arts with the wrong outlook, and that's where you find, in martial arts, that's why you find the people who are very calm and collected, because they went into it for whatever reason they wanted to, and then they sort of learn to understand violence, they learn to control themselves, they learn to express themselves in a healthy way. And then you have the people who don't know how to express themselves properly because they haven't dealt with their emotions, and they enter this martial art thinking that it's going to help their problems, but because they're going into it for different reasons, which is mostly like, I just want to beat people up, I just want to, win at these fights, they end up sort of propagating that toxic mindset, so to speak. So going off of that, it's a tricky thing talking about violence, because just to eliminate it from our lives, or to pretend it doesn't exist, or to say that violence is evil, is misunderstanding what violence actually is. What violence does, it puts us into action. It puts us into a state where we need to get something done. We can channel that violence into something productive, not necessarily destructive, killing people. Violence can reach different facets of all life. You look at Hell's Kitchen, you have Gordon Ramsay, who's not physically attacking people, but he's violent in the way he commands people and the way he tells people how to cook. It's a very violent atmosphere, so to speak, but it's not violent in the physical sense. It's very violent as a matter of fact, but he's not doing it based off of an emotional or ideological thing. He wants to get things done. He wants to uplift people. He wants to uplift these cooks or restaurants, or he's in a bunch of different shows, but he wants to bring people out of that state of mediocrity, and he does it in a violent method. And that's valid. That's very important, I think, in what he does, which, people watch it for entertainment value, but they don't see the value of it on its own. And the same thing with Simon Cowell, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but, American Idol kind of thing. And Sometimes we need that violence in our lives in order to really get a slap in the face of reality, that we can't continue into a delusional mindset, which a lot of us fall into. And it's a lot of us are falling into right now in the world. We fall into ideological traps, we fall into emotional traps, we fall into these periods of anxiety and depression. And a lot of the times right now what's popular is people think that we need to be supportive, we need to be helpful, we need to help people, we need to be supportive and caring and understanding. And this isn't to negate those aspects or think those things are wrong in any particular sense, but there needs to be a balance. And sometimes those things aren't going to help people because it coddles people into feeling like it's okay to feel this way. It's not okay to feel this way. We should be moving up and beyond that. And sometimes we need that violence to get a kick in the ass and say, no, shut the fuck up. Like, pull yourself together, stop feeling sorry for yourself, and move on with your life. I think a perfect example, I tweeted this about like a week ago, is Tony Soprano. If you've watched The Sopranos, you obviously know Tony Soprano is the protagonist, and he goes through this period of extreme anxiety and depression. He's seeing a therapist. He's very depressed and sort of out of it in his life, and he's not going anywhere. And then all of a sudden he's like, I forget where exactly. He's like coming out of the bakery or something, right? And he's, walking to his car, and then all of a sudden these guys come out of this car and they start like trying to gun him down. He has to defend himself. He has to find his way out. He has to protect himself. He eventually survives, and then he feels great the rest of the day because he has that violent kick in the ass that says, okay, yeah, like, you're feeling depressed and anxious, but like it's time to get back to reality. It's time to face your life and stop fucking around here. And I think that's important for people to understand. There needs to be this balance, that we can't just shun violence away, because all that does is repress it inside of you. And when you repress the violence that naturally exists in all of us, because we're all animals, we're all programmed by our DNA to be hunters and gatherers and warmongers. The majority of human history is war, right? So that's all in us, whether we like it or not. And we need to express that. If we want to live in a civil society, we need to find an outlet for that. Otherwise, it gets built up and it gets repressed. And when it gets repressed, that's when you have violent outbursts. And we see that in the world. You want to take a look at the number of school shootings. And why are all these school shootings happening by men, specifically white men? Let's be real here. White men in the West are very repressed in terms of they live in the very nice white picket fence where they're not exposed to any kind of violence. And I mean, any kind of violence. They have no discipline. They have no sense of values. They have no sense of living in general. They have no sense of reality. They're trapped in this weird utopian, dystopian world, and that's why it gets repressed. It doesn't happen to women. Women don't become school shooters for many reasons, and that's just because they don't have to deal with the testosterone. They don't have to deal with that violence that exists, particularly in men. And I'm not really a sociologist or whatever, but it's my understanding that the reason why, like, if you say like men of color or whatever, like people, like just men who come from different cultural backgrounds, let's just say, because it's not necessarily all white men. It's specifically like the suburbanite white middle class men, which are majority white, but there's a lot of lower class people, upper class people, wherever. It doesn't really matter what background you come from. It's just that demographic takes up the majority. But if you look at the other demographics of people, the reason why they don't really make up the school shooter terrorist part of the world is because they come from backgrounds that do have violence. Whether that's negative or positive is not really relevant. Whether they come from the ghetto and they're exposed to violence on a real day-to-day basis, or they come from a hardworking family with very strong patriarchal values, and they experience violence and not at a physical violent, like guns shooting up people kind of way, but more in a patriarchal, fatherly kind of way. They have a strict dad or whatever. It's complicated though. There's no real answer to why this is happening, but it's just my observation that there is a deep misunderstanding about violence in the world, and that's why we're having so many of these repressed outbursts of violence that are popping up now more and more, because we keep trying to repress it. We keep trying to say this is bad, we need to get rid of it, we need to spray the Febreze over this violence and pretend it doesn't exist. And it does exist. It's in us. Like, you can't ignore it forever, otherwise you're just gonna keep making things worse. And part of that, I think, is the importance of understanding violence and understanding when to use it in a proper context, and for people to understand it from a young age. I think one of the things is understanding violence from when you're a kid. And right now, we have a lot of kids who are isolated and not playing outside with each other. And that's when you sort of learn violence. You sort of learn to not fuck around, to know that there is the big kid on the block you don't mess around with. And there is this weird connotation that school shootings happen because of bullying. I don't really think that's the case. I think it's actually the lack thereof. I mean, bullying is also a tricky subject to get into, because I was bullied myself. I never really wanted to commit a school shooting when I was bullied. I just sort of accepted the reality and kind of, it sucked. But there's more to it than just the bullying. The bullying definitely doesn't help, but there is an aspect of the connection that especially young boys have in terms of competition and understanding competition, when to use it healthily, when it becomes cutthroat, and when to sort of stray away from that. And I think that's the issue that people don't really want to talk about, is finding the balance within violence, not necessarily eradicating it or promoting it, because we live in this very polarized world now. We have to take one side or the other. This isn't about taking one side. It's about understanding what's going on and understanding how to move forward and how to achieve health, on a mental aspect, on a physical aspect. You know, violence finds itself in other ways and other outlets. It doesn't necessarily have to be martial arts. It could just be working out in general. It could just be just physical activity. It's ironic, but you won't find a buff guy shooting up a school. Like, think about every school shooter that's existed. They're all out of shape. They're all like skinny fat. They're just kind of just not in good shape at all, because they don't have an outlet. They don't have that physical outlet to release that violence inside of them. So it builds up over time, and then it kind of explodes, which I would say it's a very real way to alleviate violence healthfully, is to just exercise or to do competitive sports or to do martial arts. And people are going to disagree with me on that. People are going to get angry about that. I've already experienced it, because it's such a simple solution that people think it needs to be this big complex thing, or people need to, like, we need to get rid of guns, it's video games, they want to blame everything. And, you know, it's not just one big thing. It's a lot of little things that build up over time. And I think people need to understand that. And, you know, it's a process of healing, right? There's a process of healing that needs to go on. And there's a sense of masculinity that needs to be healed that hasn't ever really. I don't think there's a moment in history where masculinity has actually been fully healed to where we aren't living in a toxic masculine mindset anymore. It happens on an individual basis, but I'm talking on a collective basis, on a collective understanding. There's been a lot of strides towards feminine healing, feminine understanding, which has only been happening since, I would say, the 1960s, maybe the 1920s, but that was more of a legal aspect of, like, you know, women's rights, women voting. But in terms of actually understanding femininity in the world, that only happened in the late 60s. So the past 50 years has been a big revolution in feminine understanding, which I think was very important. I think it's gotten a little out of hand lately in terms of, radical feminism, which is just kind of stupid. It doesn't help anyone, not necessarily men. I don't think it helps women at all to begin with, but that's just another discussion whatsoever, and not really in my element, and why I'm not really going to discuss it, because I'm not a woman, so why would I talk about women's issues? But I'm a man, so I'll talk about men's issues, and I don't expect women to talk about it because they aren't men. And when we're talking about violence, violence is very much a masculine distortion, a masculine concept. It's difficult to discuss violence because I don't think there are enough words to deviate from violence, because violence can mean a lot of different things, and there's just, the language is sort of unrooted in terms of understanding it on a deeper level, in terms of understanding different concepts about violence, which I think need to be addressed. On top of that, it is a masculine concept, that violence is in all men, and there needs to be a new healing process for men and masculinity. Otherwise, it's going to continue being toxic. It's going to continue in this cycle of just self-hating and just bullshit, And this is very much a thing that women should want, There's a lot of this, men going their own way, meninist type of crap, which is basically just men being pathetic and like wanting to have their own little group. It was like, well, if women have their own little group, then we're gonna have it. And I'm definitely supportive of men's support groups in some kind of way. I don't think but a lot of them that are coming out are like these very bitter, like cynical, like, oh, well, women want to have their own little meaning, why can't we have our own little meaning? It's just kind of pathetic in that sense. And I think there needs to be an aspect where it's men coming together that's, it's not inclusive towards women, but it's not being, what's the right word? It's not being judgmental or hateful or averting the idea of women joining, but it's just focused on what's the masculine way, what's the proper way to be a man, what's the real way to be a man. And there is a movement going on, although it's a little bit rocky. I wouldn't say it's perfect. Nothing is perfect. Just like the feminist movement isn't perfect, although it is necessary. There is this male, masculine uplifting that's going on that isn't perfect as well, but I think it is necessary because we, especially for the younger generation that are growing up in this world, we're living in a very emasculated society where our natural inclination of understanding masculinity is sort of being taken away and being misunderstood and being distorted. And that's also through porn. I was just reading this stupid article about how porn makes you more kind to women, or like creates equality, which is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. If you want to see sexism in its primal form, like literally just watch porn. It's like the most misogynistic shit ever. Like there's nothing good about it. That's just very like much a distortion of reality in the sexual aspect of the world. And I find it very weird when women are pro porn, because first of all, they don't understand it, on the concept of addiction, of a man being addicted to porn. Like, okay, like women can be addicted to porn, but like it's very much primarily a male issue when we're talking about porn addiction and porn distortion of sexuality. Like I've yet to meet a woman whose life was taken over by porn, and maybe there are some, but they're definitely the exception, not the rule. And I think this is very much a case where men are mostly affected by this problem. And when I hear a woman who's pro-porn, it's like very confusing, and it kind of irritates me, because not only is it, when they talk about it, they're talking out of a place that's completely out of their element, because they themselves aren't addicted to porn. They themselves probably don't even watch porn to begin with. They also don't understand that porn actually makes women's lives worse collectively. Like the way it shapes men's view on women is very objectifying. I've never like anytime I've watched porn, like anytime afterwards, or if I'm just like, in a frenzy of from porn, I don't view women the same. It's a very gross, objectifying way where I find it hard to view them as a person, and it's not healthy, and I recognize that. And there's a lot of men who don't recognize it, and they just act on their perverted pornographic impulses, and that's when we have, just creepy shit that goes on. And if you're a woman, you know what I'm talking about. I don't need to explain it, like you already know. I'm kind of deviating on topic. I'm deviating off topic, deviating from the topic of violence in itself, but these things are all kind of connected. It's all that primal desire to express oneself in a physical aspect, in a masculine aspect, and I think that's what violence really is at the root of it. And if we're going to talk about how do we deal with violence, to deal with violence is not to eliminate it, it's not to encourage it, it's to channel it, it's to lead it to a place where we subjectively know is the right way and for our highest good. When we channel violence into a negative part, we know that it's not good for us in the end. We know it's not going to make us happy. We know it's going to make us miserable. And anybody who's been mad knows this. You don't feel good when you're angry and violent and you smash up a wall or a computer or beat someone up. You don't feel good in that moment. So why act on that impulse based off of emotion? When you use violence is when you realize, okay, like when you're purely objective and you're just seeing, okay, there's a situation that's happening to me. How do I deal with it? Well, the only way really is to get a little violent. This guy's coming at me with a fucking baseball bat. I got to go in there and like figure it out and punch him and take him down, and you got to go all out. And that's the proper use of violence, right? That's a violent situation, but you're not going about it in a negative aspect. You're not going about it on an emotional drive. And the same thing goes in even warfare. If you take a look at Hitler, for instance, I mean, he was a very emotionally charged person, and that's where the violence originated from. It was emotional, it was jealousy, it was hatred towards the Jews. And he said, okay, fuck them, let's just kill them all. And that was because that didn't bring him happiness in the end. He killed himself, he committed suicide, and you look throughout his entire career, he was not a happy man, being this conqueror of countries, going around, taking over and killing people. He was not happy doing that. It didn't bring him fulfillment at the end of the day. When we look at violence and the warfare of something that is actually productive, which, believe it or not, does exist, we can take a look at the American Civil War. We can take a look at when America became its country, when it was fighting the British. That was based off of a very rational choice of how we're going to build a new nation that's the best we can. And it had to happen through a war. That was the only way it would happen. At that point, that was the only way that could happen. And the Civil War, and we all know what led to that, was the abolishment of slavery, which I'd like to think that was a good thing. Some people might not agree, but fuck them. And that's the reality, is that when violence is being used in an objective way, in an understanding way, and knowing when to use it and how to use it and how it could actually benefit us, that's when it actually becomes useful. And to stray away from emotional bits of violence, not ideological bits of violence, because that's when you get into the trap. That's when you get into a trap of violence that doesn't bring you to your highest self. It's just violence for the sake of violence because you don't know how to react to a certain situation. So overall, that's all I really have to say, and hope you have a wonderful evening.